So is what you're saying, since there obviously was a Big Bang, since we're here, you're more comfortable with placing the morphogenetic causality as something which moves from the past toward the future rather than from the future toward the past, because the hypothesized final end state we have no evidence for?
Well, there are two things. That if the influence from the future in some sense influences creativity, if that in some sense causes new forms to come into being, once they've come into being, I think that they take on a life of their own, and there's this kind of memory aspect. I think memory is so intrinsic a part of our own life, so obviously a part of all life, so undeniably the basis of all our experience, that any view of the universe that doesn't take memory seriously as an influence from the past and tries to substitute in its place an influence from the future is going to be inadequate. And if there's an influence from the future, I don't think it can work in the realm of memory and habit phenomena, which we know very well depend on the past. Rather, it may work in the realms of the as yet, in the realms of the possible, which are the realms into which we're always moving, and they're the realms which, in fact, consciousness inhabits. I mean, consciousness is the realms of the possible, as far as I can see.
Well, I think one way to think about information coming from the future is to imagine that ordinarily this is not allowed, but to make a quantum mechanical metaphor, you can imagine bits of information that tunnel into the past in the way that particles overcome energy transitions by magically appearing on the other side of them without ever having gone over them. And it's possible to imagine that a very small amount of information actually leaks into the past, and that this information becomes the province of seers and shamans and visionary thinkers of all sorts, that creativity is this appetition. You know, there's a word in Gaelic, haraeth, which means simultaneously nostalgia for the past and the future. And it seems to me that kind of nostalgia for the past and the future is what drives great creative spirits, poets, and visionaries. And it has this enchanted, this fey kind of aura about it, because information from the future is necessarily magical. It exists, and yet it cannot exist, because in its existence is implicitly is a paradox.
Well, I think there are two ways that information from the future works. One isn't really so much information from the future as what I'd think of as the primary cause of the whole thing, which is the attraction of the attractor. There's something in the future which draws us, for example, forwards. And what we experience the future as is not as definite information, not even as exactly concrete plans, but more in the experience of hope, and more consciously in the experience of faith. And faith is basically a vision of the future which we believe in and believe is the right one for us and to which we're attracted. So people who have, as we read in thousands of books on how to get on in business, if you have faith that you're going to succeed, you really believe that you're going to be rich, then the chances are you may well be so. Whereas if you don't actually want to be rich, and if you don't have faith in it, and if you don't keep putting out that kind of image, and if you don't have that hope and so on, then the chances are you won't be rich. So there's also the kind of religious faith that drew the Pilgrim Fathers to the United States, and it was the faith from the Judeo-Christian heritage, the promise of the faith in the promised land, the promise of a land in the future or somewhere else which will be flowing with milk and honey, where there will be bounty, prosperity, the land will yield up its riches. The land, of course, of the original promised land wasn't empty. It had inhabitants in it, but they were killed off, and their land was appropriated. And this was the promised land was that, and it's America. And that dream of the promised land which drew everybody here to America, or their ancestors, is this kind of hope, this drawing, this attraction, is what actually we know from our own experiences how this attraction works. It works through faith, through vague mythic hopes, through sense of promises as yet unfulfilled, and so on.
Well,
So
the disturbing thing about that, then, is what you referred to, this utter conviction in the approaching end of the world, which motivates vast numbers of people caught up in this monotheistic myth system. All the major monotheistic religions appoint an end to the world, and for several of them it's soon.
But you see, I think we're in a worse way than you may think, because if we say, all right, let's not bother so much with these monotheistic religions, what other models? Since I think that if morphic resonance works, then it means that our collective unconscious, and particularly our cultural unconscious, contains elements which they're so deep down, they influence us much more deeply than we know. And the Anglo-Saxon race, the English language, its cultural roots are in Germany. And the Germanic gods, the whole Germanic mythology is that the whole age will end in a twilight of the gods. And one of the problems that Hitler had in reviving the German gods is that entire theology of those gods, the entire pagan system of the Germanic gods, is one that comes to an appalling end in the twilight of the gods. Even the gods die out in this twilight of the world, when there's a destruction of all things, Ragnarok. So even if we look to pagan mythic sources, as well as the Judaic ones, and even if we look to the Hindu mythic sources, the idea of the Kali Yuga at the end of every age, where there's this densification of time, and finally the entire universe is dissolved. And then at Brahma, it's the inhaling of the breath of Brahma, and then a new universe is created or breathed out. It seems to me that a great many of these have this view that would lock into the idea of an end to time.
Yes, well, or an end to history.
Or an end to history.
It's occurred to me recently in thinking about this, my own model of time comes to an abrupt end. For all of its prophecies to work, there has to be an end date assigned, and it only works when the end date is assigned very close to the end of the Mayan calendar, which is 24 years in the future. So I've spent a great deal of time trying to imagine how the world could end in 24 years. How is such a thing possible without just, God Almighty descending in a chariot of flame? But how could it happen without that? Could there be a plausible scenario created that would have our world utterly end in 24 years in a happy way? And it occurs to me that the way in which this is to be accomplished is staring us in the face. It is simply this, that shortly after the first few years of the next century, a technology will begin to be developed, the purpose of which will be to transmit a message forward into time. And unbeknownst